Hi, I'm Mark from eReplacementParts.com. Welcome to part 3 of our video series on the removal, disassembly, and reassembly of a Troy-Bilt small frame tiller transmission. In part 1, we showed you how to remove the transmission from the tiller. Part 2 covered the disassembly of the transmission. In part 3, we are going to show you how to put the transmission back together. Let's get started. Before we get started reassembling the transmission, I want to go over a few specialty items you're going to need to do it. You'll need a tube of liquid gasket for when we seal up the end cap on the transmission. You're going to need some calipers to measure some bearing shims. You'll need a torque wrench that reads in inch-pounds for some of the fasteners. And last, you'll need a dial indicator to measure bearing lash on the main drive shaft. Most of these tools can be picked up at a specialty tools store, and in some cases you can even rent them from an automotive store. Let's get started. We'll begin with the wheel shaft. If you're replacing this component, or if you removed it earlier, you'll need to reinstall the woodruff key. Just place it into the shaft and then tap it in place with a rubber mallet. Now I'm going to install one of the bearings. Because I've removed the oil seal on only one side of my transmission, I need to install the bearing on the side where the oil seal is still installed first. I just slide that back down into the housing. Now I can install the wheel shaft back into the transmission, along with the wheel shaft gear. The wheel shaft gear is the one with the smaller teeth on it. I'll slide the wheel shaft gear through the top of the transmission and line up the axle into the center hole. Now I need to install one of the spacer washers between the gear and the bearing that I already installed. I'll continue to slide the shaft through the gear and the bearing. Once the woodruff key contacts the gear, I'll rotate the gear until the key lines up with the groove on the gear. Right there. Now I'll install the second spacer washer, followed by the other bearing. And I'll secure the bearing with a retaining ring. Now I'll replace the oil seal that we had to destroy when we removed it. I'm going to take and put a little bit of oil around the opening of the seal. Now I'll slide it onto the shaft. With the seal in place, now I'll go ahead and seat it with a rubber mallet. Now we repeat the same process with the tying shaft. Again, I'll install the woodruff key if it's been removed. Now I'll install the bearing on the side of the transmission housing where I left the oil seal. Now I'll install the tying shaft and the tying shaft gear. And between the gear and the bearing, I'll install one of the spacer washers. I slide the tying shaft into the gear until the woodruff key touches the side of the gear. Now rotate the gear around until the woodruff key lines up with the groove. There we go. Next comes the spacer washer, then the bearing, and I secured the bearing with a retaining ring. And now install the other new oil seal. Again, I want to put a little bit of the oil on the inside portion of the seal. And slide it over the shaft. And again, I'll seat the seal with a rubber mallet. Now we can reinstall the main drive shaft. I'll start by reinstalling the bearing retaining ring on the wheel shaft end of the transmission. Now I'll install the tapered roller bearing again on the wheel side of the transmission. I'm going to separate the bearing from the race and install the race back into the casting. I have to line this up just right, then I'll use a screwdriver to tap it into place. Now insert the main shaft back into the transmission housing from the tying shaft end. Once the end of the shaft gets over the wheel gear, I'll reinstall the tapered bearing. And I'll tap this into position with a rubber mallet. Now I'm going to reinstall the transmission end cap. At this point, we're only reinstalling it temporarily, so I don't want to use any sealant on it. I'll secure it with the screws, and I need to torque these screws to 100 inch-pounds. Now I'm going to use a dial indicator to measure the amount of bearing end play on the main drive shaft. The end play needs to be between 5 thousandths and 15 thousandths of an inch. It's critical that you don't skip this step. If the end play is outside of that tolerance range, it'll overheat the tapered roller bearing and cause it to fail. Now I'll take and mount my dial indicator to the transmission. Now I'll zero out the dial indicator. With the dial indicator zeroed, now I'll push the drive shaft back into the housing. With the shaft pushed back into the transmission housing, now I'll record the amount of end play. In this case, it's 38 thousandths of an inch. Now we need to do a little bit of math to figure out how thick our shim needs to be to get our bearing end play into tolerance. So I'll start with the measurement that we took, and that's 38 thousandths of an inch. From that, I'm going to subtract 5 thousandths of an inch. And this will give us the maximum thickness of our shim. Now we need to do one more calculation. Again, I take our measurement, subtract 15 thousandths of an inch, and this will give us the minimum thickness our shim can be. So we need a shim that's between 33 thousandths and 23 thousandths of an inch. I've grabbed a couple of bearing shims that I think will be close to the thickness that we need. I'm going to use a caliper to measure how thick they are. Troy-Bilt offers these shims in 4 different thicknesses, so you can combine them to come up with the proper shim for your bearing end play. So I've got almost 35 thousandths of an inch here. That's a little too thick. I'm going to get rid of my thinnest shim. We'll measure the thick one, and that's 32 thousandths, so that's perfect for what we need. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the dial indicator, and I'll remove the transmission end cap that we installed earlier. I'll install our bearing shim and replace the cap. And again, I'm going to put the cap on without any sealant because I want to double check the measurement with the shim installed and make sure we got it right. I'll set up the dial caliper one more time to measure that end play. And it measures 5 thousandths of an inch, so we're right in that tolerance range. Now that we've double checked our end play, I'll once again remove the end cap, and this time we'll seal it up with some liquid gasket. And once more, I'll torque these bolts to 100 inch-pounds. Now I'm going to install the oil seal on the wheel shaft end of the transmission. Again, I'll put a little bit of oil on the inside of the seal, slide it into place. Okay, with everything put back together, now we can refill the transmission with some fresh gear oil. Troy-Bilt specifies using a synthetic 75W140 extreme pressure gear oil. You'll probably need to go to a specialty oil supplier to find this. An empty transmission will take 24 ounces of oil. And we'll finish up by reinstalling the 2 transmission covers. You'll want to inspect the condition of the gaskets and replace if necessary. If you're using an older tiller that used the liquid gasket material, you'll want to replace that. Now that we have the transmission back together, it is just a matter of reinstalling it onto the tiller. That will be the topic in part 4 of this video series. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave us a comment or ask a question.